In November 1943, a barely known group of tiny islands in the Pacific would become the scene of some of the bloodiest fighting in World War II. The Japanese would defend their island furiously, almost to the very last man, against an invasion of U.S. Marines. After it was taken, the island group would become known to the world as Tarawa. Ellis Simon was a PFC Marine. This is where he met the enemy, on the battlefront. From 1941 through most of 1943, the Japanese military has occupied the Gilbert Islands, located 2,500 miles southwest of Hawaii. In the Gilberts is a group called Tarawa. Its principal island is Baishio, 3,800 yards long and 600 yards wide. This tiny, previously insignificant atoll has become an airfield and a defense system for the Japanese. It is one of the most heavily fortified islands in the world. Barbed wire surrounds the island. There is a daunting seawall constructed of coconut logs on the beaches. Huge guns guard the coastal approaches. Anti-aircraft guns and machine guns are strategically placed throughout the island. A series of shelters with 5-foot thick concrete roofs and 10-foot thick walls has been constructed. The Japanese have also moved in 4,500 of their best Marines to defend the island. The commander, Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, confidently declares that Tarawa could withstand an invasion force of 1,000,000 men.
The Japanese Imperial Navy was very serious about the defense of Tarawa and the Gilbert Islands because they saw it as their first line of defense in the Central Pacific against any U.S. advances towards Japanese possessions in that region. Shibasaki was a strict disciplinarian. He trained the garrison on Tarawa night and day. He systematically organized an interlocking defense built around multiple pillboxes and enclosures.
By November 1943, ships of the newly formed American Fifth Fleet began steaming toward the Gilbert Islands for the conquest of Tarawa. Aboard are 18,000 Marines, the 2nd Marine Division, tough veterans of previous engagements. Among them is Private First Class Ellis Simon, trained in anti-aircraft artillery.
Before Tarawa, we were at Nuka Fatau, which is one of the islands, but it was an occupational force. It was, we were there trying to get there before the Japanese got there.
On board, the Marines are briefed about the operation.
They showed us a map of the island, you know, telling you what wave you're going in and all of this kind of stuff. You could stand in the middle of the island and see ocean on all 4 sides. That's how small it was. When we were going there, we knew we were going to bomb for 3 days, planes and ships and everything. We're going to bomb it. And that should lay it out so we could get onto the island, and then it was up to the infantry to take it from there. We were the 3rd wave, and we figured we would go in probably around a day or so later. See, we weren't infantry, we were anti-aircraft artillery, so we did not have to hit the island first.
The invasion is set for November 20th. 1 week before, 400 planes began round-the-clock bombing. Since the air bombing cannot knock out all of Baishio's defenses, there is an all-out effort by cruisers and destroyers. As far as the High Command is concerned, the bombardment will have one objective. It will not neutralize. It will not destroy. It will obliterate the defense on Baishio.
According to radio messages that were sent back to Tokyo, about 100 sailors were killed or wounded in all of the air attacks. Where the air attacks had better success was obviously against the above-ground installations. They destroyed the airstrip and a few aircraft, barracks, some supply dumps, and some searchlights that the Japanese used for anti-aircraft defense. The Japanese Special Naval Landing Forces had a platoon of light tanks to destroy the attackers while they were still on the beaches.
Marine officers are briefed on the Tarawa assault plans. The landing includes amphibious tractors as well as conventional landing craft to take forces over the coral reef to 3 beaches called Red Beaches 1, 2, and 3. After landing, the Marines are to sweep across the airfield in the center of the island and push the enemy down the long, narrow part of the island. Some opinions estimate the operation at 3 hours. Others think it may be longer.
They figured to have it taken in about 7 to 10 days. Like any Marines, they were confident. You know, the bravado with the Marine Corps, that's the way it is. We think nothing will stop us.
Early in the morning of November 20th, Batio comes into sight. The Marines finish a steak breakfast and climb down the cargo nets into the landing craft.
The naval bombardment's greatest effect was an unintentional one. The ferocity of it cut all of the land communication lines that connected the Japanese bunkers with their command headquarters. And what this achieved, of course, was severing command and control. The Japanese positions couldn't talk to one another.
After 30 minutes, the shelling is halted to allow one final airstrike before the landing craft start their run onto the beach. Through a planning blunder, the planes are late. For those horrible 20 minutes, the Japanese fire on the unprotected landing transports. Finally, at 6:15, carrier bombers sweep over the island for a 7-minute bombardment. After the planes, the naval bombardment is resumed. In 2.5 hours, 3,000 tons of explosives have pounded the island. If the Marines are going to make it onto the beaches, the Japanese defenders must be wiped out.
A second unintentional result of the naval bombardment occurred during the afternoon of the first day of the Marine assault. Naval destroyers operating close inshore by pure chance happened to kill Admiral Shibasaki and his key staff. This, in effect, rendered the Japanese garrison leaderless.
The Japanese wait and watch the landing. Part of their plan is to make the Marines think they have been immobilized by the intense incoming artillery. For the unsuspecting Marines arriving in landing crafts, the plan works until they get close. Then all hell breaks loose. The first wave of Marines landing on Red Beach 1 is caught in a deadly crossfire. From undamaged shelters, the Japanese rake the beaches with machine gun fire, pinning the troops down behind the seawall. Another major blow to the Marines. The tide is too low, making it impossible for the amphibious tractors to get close enough to the beach.
They had trained in that kind of water, but when there's no rifles coming at you, you're all right. You don't mind it. What happened was, 2nd Division had just come from the Aleutians, where they approached an island in the Aleutians, bombed it for 3 days, and not a shot came off of it. And when they finally sent the first wave in, there was nobody there. So they thought they were running into the same thing on Tarawa, because they shelled, we shelled, and bombed it for 3 days. Not a shot came off of that island. So they thought it was another Aleutians. Those landing crafts, they were under heavy fire going in, very heavy fire. And these landing crafts would pull up to try and get onto the beach, and they would bomb them right out of the water. So naturally, when the water hit them, they would drag them up on the beach.
By 11 a.m., the commanding colonel is directing the battle from a position alongside a narrow pier which juts out into the lagoon. He orders his men to get as close to the pier as they can and not go any further. He then halts the troop landings and puts out a call for strafing. By the middle of the day, most of the amphibious tractors have been wrecked or sunk. None of the other landing craft can get over the reef. The bodies of dead and dying Marines are floating in the bloodied water. Ammunition is low, water is almost gone, and plasma is exhausted. 1,500 men are pinned down along the narrow, hellish strip of sand. At this time, the landing point on Tarawa earns its name, Beach Red. On day 1 of the invasion of Tarawa, Marines struggle to move off a narrow beach, but are pinned down by the entrenched Japanese.
From the Japanese point of view, for every Marine they shot, and they shot and killed hundreds of them, another Marine simply seemed to pop up and continue the fight. So on the first day, the Japanese did inflict heavy casualties. They did contain the beachhead, but because their communications were so completely disrupted, they were unable to take advantage of this and follow up with the counterattack.
To help break the logjam, carrier-based planes bomb and strafe almost continuously. By the end of November 20th, 5,000 Marines have made it onto the beach. About 1,500 of them are wounded or dead. As the men dig in for shelter from the enemy, nobody is sure how this operation is going to play out. The next morning, the last of the divisional reserves start to wade ashore, exposing themselves to Japanese gunfire. Halfway across the reef, they are suddenly cut down. During the night, Japanese machine gunners have hidden themselves in an old half-sunken hulk. Carrier planes come in to put them out of action. For 5 desperate hours, the reserves continued battling their way ashore. With the decimation of their numbers, when more reserves are needed, none are available. Finally, at noon on the second day, more than 36 hours late, the tide rises, and with it rise the prospects of the invasion force. For the first time since the operation began, landing craft get over the top of the reef. Men and supplies pour onto the beach. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, the commanding colonel reports, our casualties heavy, enemy casualties unknown. Situation, we are winning. Success on the beach makes it possible for the infantry to move further inland and have the anti-aircraft artillery come on shore.
As we advanced in, we'd bring the guns in, unload them on the beach, and then we'd have to bring them in to where we were going to place them on the island. Whoever was in charge would say, this looks like a good place for a 40 millimeter. So they'd start digging that in. The only thing we worried about was snipers. They were very shrewd. They would tie themselves up in palm trees. So if you fired back, you didn't know if you hit him or not because he wouldn't fall. He was tied in it. As we advanced in and in, you'd run into maybe one shot here and then all of a sudden another shot from someplace else.
By late afternoon on day one, the Japanese were pretty well beaten up. Not only were their losses heavy, but their communications were gone. What this meant was that each Japanese bunker, instead of being part of an integrated, coherent defense, now was isolated. Their world became very small.
All afternoon, casualties are evacuated. The landing craft move them out to the waiting ships in a steady shuttle service. Meanwhile, the Japanese continue to resist.
Well, that was it with any island they had. It was a fight to the death. I mean, that's the way they believed, and that's the way it was. It's pretty hard to fight a guy that says, well, I'm going to fight you till I die, That's the way it was.
Pushing the Japanese back, Marines now clean out bunkers. The smell of death is nauseating in the tropical heat. While the battle continues, the only way to take care of all of the bodies is to dig mass graves and later rest the Americans on one side and the Japanese on the other. Bulldozers cover the remains. On the third morning at Tarawa, the Japanese commander sends out his last message. Our weapons have been destroyed, and from now on, everyone is attempting a final charge. May Japan exist for 10,000 years. On the morning of the fourth day, there is another sickening revelation. The night before, the Japanese ran screaming into the Marine lines in a last frantic banzai charge. Their 300 dead bodies are strewn across a grim landscape. Only 500 Japanese are still alive. The Marines move in against these final defenders in a steady and relentless approach. From 8 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon, the Marines are able to eliminate 475 of the remaining 500 Japanese.
Being inside a Japanese bunker, a Japanese soldier must have felt that he was in his own tomb. By this time, casualties were heavy. The whole tiny atoll just reeks of cordite. It reeks of rotting corpses because, remember, you're only about 100 miles north of the equator. The dead bodies are already decaying. You've probably got dead and wounded inside of that bunker. Beyond that, you've just got an enormous and unending volume of noise from artillery bursts, from gunfire.
For those who are stubborn enough to hold out, the Marines call in the flamethrowers. Death is immediate for anyone caught in the Inferno's path.
Robert Sherrod, a correspondent who covered the landings, later wrote a wonderful book about the battle. And in there, he has a chilling description of stabbed and hacked up Marines and Japanese laying inside of the bunkers, where even there they fought hand to hand to the death.
In a rare case of surrender, a Japanese soldier has had enough. He will be one of only 17 of the original force to survive Tarawa. Seabees and Marine engineers work all morning on the airstrip. At noon, the first carrier-based plane comes in for a landing. 1:12 in the afternoon, just 75 hours after the first Marine hit the beach, Tarawa is declared secured. Ellis Simon would return to private life and pursue a career in sales.
Well, I wouldn't exactly say I won the war, but everybody had their own thing to do, and that was it.
The Japanese, I think, underestimated the morale, the elan, the fighting spirit that the Marines brought to Tarawa. And I think this underestimation of the American willingness to close to combat was characteristic of the Japanese throughout the war. They just really did not believe the Americans were strong enough.
Tarawa provides ample testimony to those who fought to the death. This tiny hunk of coral costs 4,500 Japanese lives and 1,000 Americans. As Japanese armies advanced through Burma to take India in the spring of 1944, they met resistance from British forces determined to push them back. Japan's goal of conquest instead became a retreat which took the lives of 50,000 men. Ron Tingey was a private in the 36th Division of the British Army, here on the battlefront. In early 1942, Chinese forces defending themselves from the Japanese under the leadership of American General Joe Stilwell are soundly defeated.
I claim we got a hell of a beating. We got run out of Burma. It's humiliating as hell. I think we ought to find out what caused it, go back and retake the place.
It would be 2 years before American forces could accomplish this. Early in 1944, Japan begins its last drive of the war into India. On March 6th, the vanguard of Japan's army crosses the Chenwen River in Burma, opposite the Imphal plains of India. Within a few days, 80,000 Japanese troops are making the long trek toward the towns of Imphal and Kohima on the Indian side of the border.
The average Japanese soldier in Burma on the front lines in late 1943 or early 1944 was well trained. By Japanese standards, he was well equipped. He was a tough soldier and followed orders. The problem for the Japanese in Burma was not the infantrymen. The problem was their high command. Lieutenant General Mutaguchi Renya was likely insane. Mutaguchi was a type of officer who loved a brawl. He loved, literally, the blood and guts of warfare. General Mutaguchi's attack on Imphal and Kohima was to be completed before the onset of the rainy season in Burma, which would be the end of May of 1944. Mutaguchi was obsessed with this operation, and he pushed hard for it. He pushed his troops mercilessly because he wanted to conclude the campaign within 3 months.
Japanese Lieutenant Mutaguchi's plan to attack less than 2 months before the monsoon rains carries considerable risk. If the Japanese are not victorious before the middle of May, they can become trapped. 1 to 10 inches of rain a day falls during that time. It washes out the mountain trails behind them and floods entire valleys, preventing a line of retreat. Japanese supply lines will be cut until October. There is very little time for delay. Tough troops from India in the British Army help defend their country.
The Japanese regard for the Indian troops within the British Army was quite low. They were contemptuous of most so-called colonial armies, although the Indian formations in the British Army fought quite well during the war. But the Japanese held most of their enemies in contempt, British or Indian.
But even with Indian troops, the British forces are routed. By early April, the situation around Imphal is critical, and it's worse at Kohima. British General William Slim calls up more troops from southern India to strengthen his army in the north. Ron Tingey is a private in the Royal Sussex Infantry under General Slim.
They trained us well in India. I had 3 months jungle training and with the real stuff flying about, you know, give you some idea, but Burma's a different place to India. My job was look after the Bren gun and all that, automatic weapon. And we went in as an infantry battalion. The first job we did, we were taking a place called Hill 60.